Okay, it's time for part two, molding our little silicone creature with silicone. Now, in the part one video, I made this little creature using some monster clay and some TC808 resin eye forms and some acrylic teeth that you see there in the little creature mouth that will then be transferred to the final silicone sculpture. And of course, the point of those eye forms is to allow the final silicone piece to have allowances for the eyes, so they'll just pop right into that little silicone head. In this video, we're going to be making a silicone mold of that clay sculpture. Now, the reason for that is twofold. One, I like this little sculpture. I want to make it out of resin and maybe cast it up in polyurethane later on. But also, when we make our resin mold over this clay sculpture, this will destroy the sculpture. So the exotherm and then, of course, pulling a rigid mold off of a soft clay part will destroy that sculpture. So this silicone mold is going to give us an added layer of protection there. Just in case something goes awry, we can always go back to that silicone mold and cast another clay positive. Now, later on in this series, I'm going to be casting up our little silicone creature using some 5110 silicone, and we'll also be explaining some painting methods and, of course, how to install those eyes later on and add some hair and some finishing touches to this for our complete Halloween costume. But for now, we're just going to focus on the silicone mold. And again, the whole point of this is an added layer of safety, and of course, it allows us to cast up our piece in other materials. Now, this is going to overlap a little bit with the previous video. In that video, we ended sealing that sculpture with clear guard satin. Real important step here, seal that clay sculpture. That makes cleanup a lot easier, makes it a lot easier to get everything out of your mold later on. And I usually do about 3 layers of clear guard satin and allow that to dry for several hours, if not overnight, before proceeding. Now, once that's all dried, then I'm ready to apply my release agent. Now here, since I'm going to be making a silicone mold, I'm using Zip 301 mold release. And this is an important step also because Zip 301 does not contain any silicone oil, so it's ideal for releasing silicone from a variety of patterned surfaces. And now it's time to pick out the silicone that we'll be using for this mold. And for this, I'm going to be using TC5130F Fast Platinum Silicone. This is a good general purpose kind of Swiss Army knife silicone to have around that serves a variety of purposes, and it's very easy to use. It's a 1-to-1 mix ratio, fast working time of 7 minutes, and a fast demold time of around an hour, hour and a half, and has a medium softness of about 25 Shore A and a low viscosity for poured molds. And real important detail for this mold is we're going to be making a brush-on mold, so we're going to be thickening this using the SC5001 thickening agent. Now, very important note here, this is a platinum silicone. That means it can be inhibited by some contaminants, mainly sulfur-based clay. So be very careful to make sure you're always using sulfur-free clay for any kind of process like this. And when in doubt, do a small test on your sculpture with a small batch of silicone to make sure you don't have any cure issues. Now, overall, I think this little mold took maybe a little bit over a pound of silicone. Doesn't take much to mold a sculpture this size. I think the first batch I did was about 200 grams. So again, this is mixed 1-to-1 by weight or volume. And one of the nice things about this particular silicone is it doesn't have to be pre-mixed. The A and B parts don't have to be stirred up before you use it. And that's really handy. So that allows it to be packaged in those much easier to use containers than the wide mouth buckets and that sort of thing. Now, we're going to add some pigment to this first batch, and I'm going to pour up some keys for later use. And I'm going to put a fair amount of pigment in this so that it's a nice opaque white. Now, before I start applying my silicone to my clay sculpture, I'm going to mix this up and pour it in its pourable state into these key forms. And these little blister keys like this, they don't require any release. Most silicone will release from these just fine. So I'm just going to pour this in its pourable state before I add the thickening agent. And then I'm going to set those aside for later use. So you just simply pour those up. I try to stay just shy of the top so it doesn't wind up with a little puddle around the key shape, and that way it's easy to just pop those out and stick them on the outside of the mold. And you'll see that later on in the video. And for this, I only need really about a half a dozen or so. It doesn't take many for the base of a sculpture like this, but these are really handy to get good registration on your brush-on silicone molds on parts like this. Now, once I poured up those keys, I'm going to use the remainder as my print coat. And because I want this to stay put on my sculpture a little bit more than a really runny print coat, I'm going to add a little bit, about 1% of the SC5001 thickening agent. And as soon as that thickening agent reacts with the silicone, it's going to convert that to a brushable paste consistency. And we need that so that our silicone will stay put on a vertical surface. We want this to have a little bit of slump, but we don't want it to be so runny that it just runs off the piece. Now what I'm doing here is just pulling out any loose bristles on these cheap brushes, because anytime you're making a brush-on mold for silicone or polyurethane, anything like that, you got to use these little chip brushes, because any nice paintbrush will be destroyed. So you can't dissolve the silicone or polyurethane out of the brushes. So make sure you're using throwaway brushes for that purpose. But the downside of those little brushes is the little hairs will come out easily. So it's always a good idea to pull those out beforehand. And as you see there, I'm just starting by dumping the silicone over the top of the head, letting gravity do some of the work for me, and then steering that around. You see I had one of those little bristles right there. And now just brushing that all over the piece. And this is again where it really helps to have a good armature and have your piece properly anchored to your baseboard, so you can pick that up and move it around at different angles and make sure you get that silicone all over your piece and get a nice bubble-free surface. Now this little sculpture doesn't have a whole lot of surface detail, but if you have something with a lot of really pronounced deep texture, it's a good idea to use an air hose or even a can of compressed air to very gently at low pressure push the silicone into that surface detail. And that's something that again requires a little bit of practice, and I'll cover that in a future video, but using compressed air can really help push that silicone into the detail. You just have to be careful not to overdo that and mess up your sculpture. Now I'm checking to see if that's ready for another coat. This is about 10 to 15 minutes later, and it's gelled enough where you can do that trick where you tap on the surface, and when you can do that where it's sticky but it doesn't come off on your finger, that's a good indicator that you're ready to apply more silicone. Now the second batch, we're going to do exactly the same thing. I'm going to put a little bit more white pigment, and then I'm also going to be adding more of the thickening agent. This time I'm going to be adding a little bit more than 1%, so it's a little bit thicker than it was on the first layer. Now, the reason I stuck with the same silicone pigment as I did on the first layer, so you see I'm going white on more white, is so that the inside of the mold will look a nice, clean white color. And not a big deal, but just aesthetically, it just looks a lot nicer to have one uniform color on the inside of the mold, just my personal preference here. And from the outside, it does make it a little bit easier to see when I can't see the clay through the silicone. That's a good indicator that I have a nice coating all over the piece. And what we're going for here is really only about 1/4 of an inch thick all over the part. Now it's going to be thicker in some areas, some of the undercut areas around the ears and the nose and places like that, but overall what you want is an average of about 1/4 of an inch thick and 3/8 of an inch at the absolute most. If you start getting thicker than that on a brush-on mold, you start actually having to work against the thickness of the rubber to demold your part. And it's important to remember with a brush-on mold like this, you're not thinking in terms of how many layers you're applying as much as the overall thickness that you're creating. Because with a catalyzed silicone like this, you could make this an inch thick with one layer if you were so inclined. But we're really thinking about the overall thickness we get. So the whole point in multiple layers is to minimize air entrapment. So we're doing 2 thinner coats, and then we're going to do 1 thick follow-up layer with a lot of thickener and spackle that on to build up the final thickness of our mold. Now what I'm doing here is just trimming off any of those little drips, and we're ready to apply our final layer. And like I said, all in all, this took just a little over 1 pound of silicone to make this mold. Now, this is another batch of 5130F. with silicone pigment. This time I'm using blue and more of the thickening agent. You see now I've added enough to make it a really nice, thick, trowelable paste. And we're going to apply that using a brush and also a little palette knife. You see that little steel palette knife in the foreground. So what I like to do when I'm troweling this on is I like to first brush this all over the part and build it up fairly thick, and then come back and trowel it to smooth everything out on the surface. Just always remember that later on we'll be making a two-piece mother mold over the top of this brush-on silicone mold, and you want that to be as smooth as possible. You want to simplify the form and eliminate undercuts and make sure that your two-piece shell can come on and off without creating distortions in your casting. So you see now I'm going back with a stir stick to trowel everything out, and then I'm going to switch over to that palette knife for a little bit more detailed work with that. And remember, the clock is ticking. This particular material has a 7 to 8 minute working time at room temperature, so you want to keep track of your time and make sure you don't let that get away from you. And when you're working with some of these silicones, these fast setting formulas for the first time, sometimes it's a good idea to start with a small project and get used to the speed and the working properties of this before you do something large scale. And here I'm using the palette knife to come in and clean up that surface and smooth everything out. I really like working with palette knives for brush-on molds. You can get these really nice angled, drafted sides of the mold and make everything really nice and clean before you proceed to your mother mold. Now, one final step you can do after you're done troweling on your last layer of silicone. You can also use some soapy water to smooth out the outside even more. And I'll get to that here in just a minute. But right now what I'm doing is just using that palette knife to smooth out that flange at the base of my mold. And I want to make sure that's as smooth as possible so that I can put those keys all around that base and have a nice registration point with my shell. Now in the future, I'm going to do a whole tutorial just about keys and the why and how of key systems and things like that. But one of the things with a small mold like this you want to avoid is putting keys on an area like the face, because if, heaven forbid, that key does not align properly later on, or something gets inside the mother mold in the little shape where the key goes, you could have a really deformed casting come out of the mold. Now, one last little detail, these little key forms, when you cast these, you want to use them as soon as possible and try not to touch that exposed surface. That area on top where the silicone cures, right there on the top, don't do what I'm doing right there. Don't touch the top. That's bad, and that will cause that not to stick to the silicone on your mold. So real important detail there. Now, this is before our silicone is set. This is right after I've stuck those keys in place. We're still just towards the end of that working time of the silicone. And now what I've done is I've mixed up a little slurry of mold soap and warm water. And I've wet my fingers with that, and then I'm using that to press down any of those little like meringue peaks that you get when you're applying that with a trowel. And just smoothing that all out. And you can spend as much time on that as you want, getting that really nice and smooth. Again, the whole point here is to smooth everything out so that your mother mold comes on and off as clean as possible without any possible distortions of having a little wrinkle in the mold when you put everything back together. That's one of the problems with having a lot of little undulations and brush marks and things like that in your silicone mold, is if those misalign when you reassemble your mold, that creates distortions in your cast. Now, for the sake of time, I'm just going to do a quick overview of the mother mold process. I'll link at the end screen to a previous tutorial where I did a much more in-depth explanation on a plaster bandage support shell. So be sure to check that out if you're new to the process. Overall, this is like one of the simplest ways to make a mother mold. And it's ideal for this kind of little shop mold where mainly the whole point of this mold is really for safety more than anything else. So we have a fallback just in case something goes wrong with our resin mold. We have a mold of the original sculpture in all its glory, so we could always go back and pour more monster clay into that and make a clay original again. So that is the point of this mold, and of course also I'd like to pour up a little resin bust of this later on. So I'm doing the first side. This is typically done in 2 halves. I do the first side, dividing this in half, front to back. And then once that front sets up completely, I'm ready to wax that with some Pardal No. 2 paste wax. And then allow that paste wax to dry and make the back half of the mold. So this is after the back half is made, and I'm ready to demold those 2 halves. And if everything was done in accordance with the prophecy, you should easily be able to pry off that back half of the mold and then carefully remove the front half. And now we have our finished silicone mold of our little creature. And now I'm just going to do a straight cut down the back. No sense in doing a zigzag line. This is going to be a very simple small mold that will realign without any issue. So no point in getting too complicated with that cut. And now you see our finished silicone sculpture inside. And you see the only thing that has happened to that is that slit down the back. So that'll be easy to resculpt that and get this ready for the final resin mold. And I'm sure this mold will make an appearance later on when I go back to recast this in resin. So stay tuned for that. Probably after the Halloween season, I'll come back and do just a basic resin cast into that finished silicone mold. Now in the next video, I'll be making the resin mold, a 2-piece resin mold of this clay sculpture. And then I'll be following that up with some painting and of course some patching and hair work techniques. So stay tuned for all of that. And as always, the product links to everything I used in this tutorial, the links will be in the video description, so be sure to check those out. And of course, check the end screen for related videos on brush-on molds that I mentioned earlier. And as always, if you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe and comment for the algorithm, or if you have any comments or questions about this process. And of course, thanks for watching.